Hi, my name is Olivia Odo, and I'm going to be speaking about web accessibility. So the goal of web accessibility is to enable people with disabilities to participate equally on the World Wide Web. Poorly designed websites can create barriers that exclude people from using them. There are people with a diverse range of hearing, movement, sight, and cognitive abilities who access the web. And some of these people use assistive technologies such as screen readers, screen magnifiers, and speech input. Therefore, it is important for everyone to be able to access the web equally. And there are negative consequences. There can be if your website is not accessible. For example, in 2006, the National Federation of the Blind filed a lawsuit against Target because blind users were not able to complete online purchases without the use of a mouse. So this is important to keep in mind, but it shouldn't be your motivation behind making your website accessible. So I'm going to go over some simple tips on how you guys can make your websites more accessible. Websites should provide enough contrast between text and its backgrounds. The minimum contrast ratio for text is 4.5 to 1. And if you have larger text, which is classified as 24 pixels, the contrast ratio can be 3 to 1. So the pink and the white passes, but the blue and the white fails the contrast ratio check. And this is important for users with low vision and color vision deficiency because they need to be able to read the content on websites. So you can Google like color contrast checker and you can test to see if your colors meet the minimum requirements. And it is important for images to be accessible because people who use screen readers have images read out loud to them so they know what they are. There are different types of photos. Different types of photos have different alternative text requirements, so I'll go through a few of those. If your image is informative, so if it represents concepts or information, you should have an alternative text that gives a short description of what the photo is. So in this example, if the screen reader read aloud the little description blurb, the person wouldn't know what the text is referring to. So in this case, you would use the alt attribute to write something like Brooklyn Bridge, New York City. And if your image is decorative, if it's just there to improve the look of your website, you do not need to provide a text alternative, but you still need to have the attribute. It just needs to be set to null. If you leave it out completely, the screen reader will read the file name, which adds audible clutter and distracts users from the actual content. And if an image is functional, meaning it initiates an action, then the text alternative should describe what will happen when the image is selected. So if you had a link that prints a page, it's an image, just write print this page. But I never find myself using images in links and buttons. I always use font awesome icons, and you can make these accessible as well. For example, if your icons convey meaning like the stars, you can set the ARIA hidden attribute to true, so the screen reader will just skip over all the icons and then it'll hit the alternative text, the span element, which would read out 4.5 out of 5 stars. So anyone with a screen reader knows what the meaning of the icons is. And you can hide this with CSS, you just have to do it correctly, which I will explain later. And keyboard input is really important. A website should not rely on the mouse. A user should be able to use every aspect of a website without the mouse. There are users with motor disabilities, blind users, users with no muscle control who cannot use a mouse, and also users who use speech input. they often give commands that mimic a keyboard, so they need to be able to use a keyboard as well. Users that use keyboards normally tab through a web page, and they can hit enter to navigate. So you should let the user know where they are on the page. So I'll show a bad example of this. So on this website, the Wall Street Journal, if you start tabbing, you can't see where you are on the page. Airbnb, for example, you start tabbing, you can see where you are. So this is much better for a user who is using the keyboard. And the focus outline is it's a default style in most browsers. I think Airbnb was using the default style, so just make sure to never explicitly turn the focus outline off by setting it to 0 or none. But you can customize it to match the color scheme of your site. And forms need to be accessible because people with cognitive disabilities need to be able to complete forms easier. When they are provided with instructions and feedback, this can help them. So there's a lot you can do to make forms accessible. I'll just go over labeling form instructions and user notifications. So every form field input should have a label, and this is important because users who use speech input say a command related to the label so they can focus on the input. And it's also important for people with motor impairment because they can click on the label and it'll select the input. It might be hard for some users to click on this tiny little circle. So that's one reason labels are important. And labels shouldn't be placeholders. A lot of screen readers don't support placeholders, and the default style for a lot of placeholders is very faint. It doesn't pass the contrast requirements. And then also, if you use just like placeholders that aren't labels, you can't click on these to select the radio buttons. And the user should be given instructions like in the label, so let them know what's required. If you want something filled out a certain way, like a date or a phone number, let them know what the pattern is to make it easier. And then you should let them know if their input is valid or invalid. So they should be provided with some information on how they can fix their input. And it's actually better to provide icons as well rather than just text. So like an X or a check, that's important. And you should never rely just on color to give the user feedback. So for example, if like this bar just turned green and this turned red, that isn't good. You should at least provide, you can use color, but provide an icon or some additional text. And if you do decide to hide alternative texts, such as like the span and the set of icons, you can hide it, but if you set the display to none or visibility to hidden, that hides it from the screen reader as well, which defeats the purpose of putting the alt text there in the first place. So this example from W3C is the correct way to hide text visibly but keep it available to the screen readers. And I just want to encourage everyone to check out W3C's accessibility guidelines because there's a lot more into web accessibility that I wasn't able to cover. And I have a personal web accessibility blog if you guys want to check it out. And thank you guys for listening.